Some designs are timeless, like the steel helmet that shielded 1,000 foreheads, and the Colt 45 pistol that stopped 1,000 charging feet. At first glance, it was an unlikely hero of the Second World War. A blocky, heavy sidearm designed back in 1911, carried on the hips of Marines and soldiers who trudged through mud, sweat, and salt air. It looked almost primitive compared to the sleek rifles that dominated the battlefield. To many eyes, especially those of Japanese troops, it seemed more relic than threat. They laughed at it, dismissing the weapon as an outdated American toy, a trinket of a bygone war. In the heat of the Pacific, where bayonets gleamed and bamboo thickets swallowed men whole, the pistol appeared little more than a cumbersome ornament hanging from a soldier's belt. But laughter has a way of souring when the first shot cuts through it. The Pacific theater was no place for illusions. Jungle humidity clung to every surface, rifles swelled with moisture, and boots rotted before their soles wore down. Men fought not only an enemy, but the land itself, with mosquitoes biting as relentlessly as bullets. Amid this brutal environment, the Japanese came with confidence rooted in discipline and tradition. Their Arisaka rifles, long and sturdy, gave them reach in open combat. Their bayonets, sometimes longer than the rifles of their opponents, symbolized ferocity, a belief that spirit and steel would always overwhelm. To them, the Colt 45 seemed like an afterthought, a weapon for men too weak to face a charge with cold steel. Soldiers scoffed, calling Americans over-reliant on machines. They imagined that when the battle closed, when rifles jammed or grenades ran out, the Americans would stand exposed with only a pistol between them and death. Yet the Colt was no ordinary sidearm. Each round it carried was heavier, larger, more punishing than the slim cartridges of Europe's pistols. When it fired, it spoke with a guttural force, a sharp crack that echoed differently through jungle trees. But the Japanese did not hear that voice at first. They saw only its bulk, laughed at the weight that sagged American belts, and muttered among themselves that no civilized army would cling to such a clunky device. For the Americans, though, the pistol carried a different meaning. It was not an ornament but a safeguard, a final promise that in the chaos of a charge or the darkness of a foxhole, a soldier would not stand empty-handed. At Guadalcanal in 1942, where the first great collision of U.S. and Japanese ground forces erupted, that laughter reached its cruelest edge. Japanese patrols mocked the very sight of Marines oiling their sidearms. They told each other that American pistols would fail in the muck, that they were better suited to saloon shootouts than tropical war. And the Marines, weary and half-starved, heard those rumors carried by prisoners, or through broken scraps of translation. Some grinned bitterly, letting the enemy believe what they wished. Others worried quietly that perhaps their pistol really was too old, too heavy, too clumsy for the fight ahead. Weapons carried reputations, and reputations could comfort or erode a man's nerve. But reputations shift with experience. One evening, as shadows stretched long across the palms and the sound of crickets drowned the gunfire for a rare moment, a young Marine named Charles Evans sat cleaning his Colt. His fingers moved with the instinct of ritual. Slide back, chamber checked, barrel wiped clean. Around him older men smoked in silence. One leaned in, muttering, "They laugh now, let 'em, they'll learn soon enough." Evans looked down at the weapon. It wasn't pretty. Its finish was dulled by salt air, its grip worn from countless hands. But in its weight he felt something steady, something immovable, as though the pistol itself refused to bend to doubt. He wondered if that stubbornness would matter when the jungle lit up again. The Japanese mocked not just the pistol, but the idea behind it. That technology, not spirit, defined survival. Their doctrine celebrated the banzai charge, the roar of hundreds of voices, and the gleam of blades sweeping forward. In such moments, rifles became pikes, and pistols seemed absurdly small. What was a 7-inch barrel against 100 men? Rushing through the dark? They laughed because they could not yet imagine the answer. The answer lay in physics, in the blunt truth of velocity and impact. A 45 round, heavy and wide, carried a force designed to stop, not merely wound. It was not about elegance, it was about finality. Even as Japanese officers dismissed the Colt, American commanders understood its value. Reports from earlier conflicts, from the Philippines to the muddy fields of World War I, had proven the pistol's worth. It was designed in response to Moro warriors who had charged through smaller caliber fire unfazed, men who required a heavier punch to be stopped. That history traveled with every holstered pistol across the Pacific. Few Marines knew the details, but many felt the weight of legacy in their sidearms, an assurance that the weapon had faced doubt before and silenced it. In the camps, humor covered unease. "She kicks like a mule," one Marine would joke, shaking his wrist after firing. "But if she hits, you don't need a second shot." Laughter rippled, but it was the laughter of men reassuring themselves, not of underestimation. Across the lines, Japanese troops laughed with a different flavor, mocking, derisive, built on the belief that their courage and steel eclipsed any American contraption. The air between the two armies was thick with the sound of mirth, but it was a fragile sound, one destined to fracture. As night fell on Guadalcanal, the jungle grew restless. The moon hid behind drifting clouds, and somewhere beyond the wire, voices gathered. The Marines gripped their rifles, their grenades, their pistols. Evan's thumb brushed the safety of his Colt, feeling the click that separated readiness from hesitation. He could almost hear the laughter still, faint in his memory, as if mocking him from the darkness. He thought of the bayonets gleaming in the distance, the discipline of men who believed his pistol a joke. The night deepened, and with it came the low chant of a charge beginning to build. The laughter had carried far, but so would the gunfire. And when the first shot rang out, it would not be a rifle or a bayonet that answered. It would be the guttural bark of a pistol once dismissed, its echo cutting clean through the noise, turning expectation into shock. In that moment, laughter would stop, not because anyone told it to, but because the Colt 45 would speak for itself. And once it spoke, the jungle would never sound the same again. The baptism of fire came in the dripping jungles of Guadalcanal, where the laughter that once echoed from enemy lines dissolved into the raw roar of battle. The Marines who had been mocked for their heavy pistols now clutched them in fists slick with sweat, their ears filled with the deafening symphony of insects, gunfire, and the guttural cries of men charging through the trees. It was August 1942, and the Japanese, determined to sweep the Americans back into the sea, sent wave after wave of infantry across the tangled ground. Their doctrine prized shock and speed, bayonets fixed, voices raised in furious banzai shouts meant to unnerve before they struck. But in the undergrowth, where shadows swallowed distance and rifles snagged on branches, combat was not fought at 50 yards. It was fought at 5. Charles Evans, the young Marine who had once doubted the value of his sidearm, crouched low in his foxhole as the night trembled with sound. His Springfield rifle lay beside him, its barrel already steaming from repeated volleys. The bolt felt stiff, and his shoulder burned from the recoil of too many rounds fired in haste. Around him the line was straining, men firing wildly at shapes darting between trees. He heard a comrade curse as a jammed rifle clicked uselessly, the sound swallowed instantly by the chaos. Evans reached instinctively for the Colt at his hip. The weight he had once resented now steadied him. When the charge broke against their position, it was not the long rifles that saved them. Figures burst from the darkness, bayonets flashing, feet pounding the soft earth. Evans fired his pistol, the muzzle flash searing his night vision. The .45 slug struck the lead attacker squarely, the body collapsing mid-stride with a thud that jarred the ground. Another came, blade raised, and again Evans fired, once, twice. The recoil was sharp, but the effect immediate. The man crumpled before his momentum carried him forward. In those breathless seconds, Evans learned what no lecture could teach. The Colt did not require respect to prove itself. It demanded it. The Japanese had laughed because they believed their rifles gave them range, their bayonets courage. But the Pacific was not France in 1918. The jungle pressed men close, turning firefights into knife fights, converting riflemen into brawlers. Pistols, once dismissed as secondary, became primary tools of survival. Marines clearing dugouts, stumbling through vines, or wrestling in the mud found that the Colt's heavy bark ended a struggle in a heartbeat. Its rounds were few, 7 in a magazine, but each was a promise, final and absolute. Reports filtered back from these clashes, small stories carried by weary voices. A lieutenant whose pistol saved a machine gun nest when Japanese infantry broke through. A radio operator who fended off a sudden bayonet rush with his sidearm alone. Evans himself, whose hands shook not from fear, but from the strange, awful realization that he was alive because his pistol had spoken first. These accounts stitched together a reputation no propaganda could erase. The pistol that had been mocked as outdated now earned whispers of awe. And yet awe mixed with unease. Soldiers knew the Colt was no gentle companion. Its recoil bruised palms, its report deafened ears in enclosed spaces, and its weight dragged constantly at the belt. Some cursed it under their breath, but never with conviction. A Marine might complain, but he also checked his magazine twice before nightfall, his fingers brushing the cold steel like a talisman. In foxholes, men swapped stories of the Colt's power, exaggerating for humor but rooted in truth. "She'll knock a man clean out of his shoes," one swore. And though laughter followed, no one doubted the essence of the claim. The Japanese began to notice as well. Prisoners taken during the campaign muttered uneasily about the American sidearm. In captured diaries, officers described comrades felled instantly by single pistol shots. Their disbelief showed in the words, astonishment that a weapon so small could halt a charge so completely. For a culture that revered the bayonet and the sword as extensions of the warrior's spirit, the Colt represented something alien, something brute and undeniable. It was not noble steel. It was mechanical certainty. Still, the Marines did not romanticize it. They lived too close to death to indulge in myths. For them, the Colt was simply practical. It was what you reached for when the rifle failed, when the jungle swallowed light, when a shadow lunged out of the vines. Evans found himself cleaning it more often than his rifle, not from affection but from necessity. Each time he reassembled it, he remembered the sound of bodies falling in the dark, and the memory carried both relief and weight. He no longer doubted the pistol, but he could not forget what belief in it cost. As the Guadalcanal campaign dragged on, the pistol became a quiet equalizer. Marines under assault in the black hours before dawn trusted that if nothing else, they could still fight back with 7 heavy rounds. The weapon that had been mocked became the thin line between survival and silence. The laughter of the Japanese had faded from the jungle, replaced by their cries as charges met gunfire, and by the thud of bodies striking mud. For the Americans, it was a grim vindication, but vindication in war is always fragile. Evans would later write in a letter home, "The pistol does what it must, but you never stop hearing the echo." The echo was more than sound. It was the memory of sudden endings, of the sharp line between living and dying drawn by a trigger pull. The Colt gave confidence, but it also demanded reckoning. Men who fired it carried not only survival, but the memory of those it had dropped with finality. The jungle baptized them in this truth. By the time reinforcements arrived, Guadalcanal was littered with the remnants of failed charges and shattered illusions. The pistol that had once drawn ridicule now carried a reputation carved in sweat and blood. Soldiers no longer questioned its presence. They trusted it as they trusted their helmets and boots. Evans, once skeptical, now touched the grip with unconscious reverence, not out of pride but out of recognition. The weapon had proven itself beyond doubt, yet Guadalcanal was only the beginning. Other islands waited, each with its own jungles, caves, and desperate charges. Each would test the pistol anew, pushing its legend further. Evans knew this as he sat one quiet dawn, reloading by the pale light of a fading moon. He thought of the laughter that had once mocked his weapon, and he wondered how many voices would still dare such laughter when the campaign swept to the next shore. The Colt was no longer a joke, it was an answer. But the war was far from finished, and the questions waiting ahead would be deadlier still. The war did not pause after Guadalcanal. Victory on one island only opened the gates to another, and the Marines carried their scars forward like permanent ink. The Colt 45, once mocked, now traveled as a proven companion. On transport ships bound for Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, men adjusted their holsters with a familiarity that bordered on ritual. The pistol was no longer a backup in their minds, but an extension of survival. Charles Evans, no longer the hesitant boy who had doubted his sidearm, now checked his magazines with a soldier's superstition, as if ensuring that each round was a promise he might have to cash in. The Pacific Campaign had become an island-to-island crucible, and the Colt's voice would echo in each furnace. Tarawa, in November 1943, showed how cruelly close combat could become. The atoll was barely 2 miles long, a speck of coral crusted with Japanese fortifications. Marines waded ashore through waist-deep water, burdened by packs and fire, while machine guns raked the surf. Many never made it to the sand. Those who did found themselves crawling into bunkers so tight that rifles became burdens. Grenades went in first, and when smoke cleared, pistols led the way. Evans watched as a corporal beside him drew his Colt, its black frame gleaming in the sun, and fired into a dugout where shadows stirred. The roar was deafening in the confined space. When silence returned, the corporal muttered without looking up, "The rifles for the beach, the pistols for the war." It was not bravado, only recognition. By Saipan in June 1944, that recognition had hardened into doctrine. The Japanese fought not only above ground but below, in caves that honeycombed the volcanic hills. Rifles were too long to maneuver. Bayonets were useless in the dark. Marines crawled in pairs, one with a flashlight trembling in his grip, the other with a pistol raised and ready. Evans carried his Colt into one such cavern, the air thick with the scent of sulfur and sweat. He fired at shapes barely seen, muzzle flashes painting the rock walls in bursts of orange. Each shot was not just defense but necessity, a moment's margin between life and the unseen blade of an enemy inches away. The Japanese had stopped laughing. Captured journals spoke of the heavy American pistol with words of awe and bitterness. "It kills with one strike," one officer had written, his script shaky but clear. They had come to understand what Evans and his comrades already knew. In the close, choking corners of island war, size mattered, and the .45 delivered something final that no smaller round could imitate. The same men who once sneered at the weapon now feared its authority, yet authority came at a cost. At Peleliu, September 1944, where the coral ridges turned red under the sun, Evans saw firsthand how the pistol exacted its toll on the mind. He had used his sidearm 3 times in one day, each at a distance where he could see the whites of another man's eyes. The memory clung to him like the sticky heat. He wiped the pistol clean that night with slow, deliberate care, his face hollow. To trust the weapon was also to accept what it required. The Colt was reliable, unflinching, but it did not leave room for illusions. Each round was a full stop, not a question mark. The men spoke of it differently now. There was less humor, fewer exaggerated boasts. They carried it with quiet respect, not unlike the way a priest might carry a relic. Machine gunners swore by it, officers carried it like a badge, and riflemen envied those who had been issued one. In mess tents the stories circled, how a pistol had saved a foxhole, how a lone sergeant held off a charge with 7 rounds, how in the black maw of a cave the Colt's voice was the last word. The weapon had ceased to be just a tool. It had become part of the mythology of the campaign, proof that survival could hinge on something once considered trivial. Evans noticed the shift most when replacements arrived. Fresh-faced boys straight from training eyed the pistols with doubt, just as he once had. The veterans said little. They simply handed them spare magazines and let the islands teach their lessons. Those lessons came quickly. On Saipan, a replacement froze when his rifle jammed, only to be yanked aside by Evans, who emptied his Colt into the charging enemy. The boy's wide-eyed silence afterward was enough. Words were unnecessary. The Japanese, desperate and driven, responded with fury. Their banzai charges grew more reckless, their night assaults more frantic. They still carried their bayonets with pride, but the certainty behind their laughter was gone. Where once they had scoffed, now they braced. They had seen too many comrades fall mid-stride, cut short by a weapon they had dismissed. Irony clung to the war like smoke. The sidearm they had called a toy had become their nightmare in the dark. By Iwo Jima in February 1945, the Colt was legend. The black sands and volcanic tunnels magnified its reputation. Evans descended into caves with his pistol drawn, every step echoing against stone. The muzzle flashes carved brief, violent murals on the walls, men silhouetted, dust swirling, eyes burning. When he emerged back into daylight, his ears ringing, he carried with him the certainty that the pistol had been designed for this exact war, as though fate had anticipated the struggle decades earlier. Still, the pistol could not carry the whole burden. Its magazine was small, its weight constant. Soldiers joked grimly that the Colt will save you, but only 7 times. That was the razor's edge they walked, confidence tempered by limitation. Yet even those 7 chances meant everything. Evans often thought of the men who had laughed at the pistol years earlier. Did they know in their final moments how wrong they had been? Did they understand the cost of underestimating steel shaped by experience rather than tradition? The turning point had been reached. The Colt was no longer mocked, no longer doubted. It was feared, respected, woven into the rhythm of island war as surely as the roar of artillery or the whisper of waves against the shore. For Evans, it was both shield and shadow, a reminder that survival came not only from courage, but from the cold precision of a weapon built to stop. The pistol had transformed from a joke into a verdict, its voice unanswerable in the close quarters of the Pacific. And yet, as the war ground forward, a question remained. If one pistol could alter the rhythm of battle, what would it mean when the final island came, when the struggle reached its crescendo? Evans, weary but unbroken, knew that the Colt would be there too, speaking its blunt truth. But even he did not yet know how profoundly its voice would echo when the war neared its end. Some designs are timeless, because they are born not of fashion, but of necessity. By the war's end, the Colt 45 was no longer just a pistol. It was a companion, a symbol, and for many, the difference between silence and survival. The islands had burned that truth into the men who carried it. Charles Evans returned from the Pacific with the weight of its steel still pressed into his hip, though the holster was gone and the war behind him. In memory, however, it never left. When he spoke of the war years later, his words were rarely about strategy or generals. Instead, he spoke of the pistol that had ended the laughter, the weapon that had met a charge with finality and reshaped his idea of what it meant to endure. The legacy of the Colt was written in sweat, smoke, and silence. In Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, men discovered that survival often meant fighting at distances where breath and fear mingled. Rifles, for all their range and power, faltered in caves and thickets. The Colt thrived in them. The pistol carried only 7 rounds in a magazine, yet each one struck with an authority that no opponent could dismiss. A man might stagger through wounds from smaller calibers, but a 45 round ended the argument. The Japanese, who had once laughed, recorded in diaries their astonishment. Some wrote bitterly of comrades falling instantly, as though felled by an unseen hand. Others admitted grudging respect, noting the weapon's terrible power. The pistol that had been a joke became a shadow haunting their charges. But war's truth is not measured only in fear. It is measured also in the quiet reflections of those who survived. Evans remembered the recoil in his hand, the way it jolted his wrist and rang in his ears. He remembered how, afterward, his hands shook not from weakness but from the burden of knowing what that single shot had decided. The Colt's legacy for him was not only its stopping power, but the way it stripped battle to its essence. One man, one weapon, one chance. In those moments, history was not a grand strategy, but a flash of light and the echo of steel. That legacy extended far beyond Evans. Veterans across the Pacific carried their memories into peacetime, and when they spoke, the pistol was often present. Some praised its reliability in mud and rain, others the certainty it offered in a charge. Even those who rarely fired it still polished it, cleaned it, and carried it close, as if acknowledging its role as a silent partner. Letters home, memoirs, and oral histories revealed the same refrain. The Colt worked when nothing else did. It was not elegant, but it was faithful. In war, that was enough to make it legendary. Historians note that the pistol was born from an earlier conflict, the Philippine-American War, where smaller calibers failed to stop determined charges. John Browning's design answered that failure with brute certainty. Decades later in the Pacific, his solution once again proved its worth. That continuity, that thread of design meeting reality became part of the Colt's mystique. Soldiers who carried it into World War II felt, even if they did not know the details, that their weapon had already been tested by fire and found worthy. It was as though the pistol itself carried memory, whispering that it had faced doubt before and survived. The Japanese, steeped in traditions of steel and spirit, encountered in the Colt a different philosophy: function over form, finality over flourish. Their bayonets gleamed, their blades curved with history. But against the blunt certainty of the .45, such traditions faltered. The legacy of the pistol was not just in its mechanics but in what it symbolized: a shift in warfare, where industrial design met ancient courage, and the machine often prevailed. It was a sobering lesson, one etched into diaries and lived in silence by those who once laughed. Evans, in later years, sometimes pulled his sidearm from a drawer where it rested, scarred and aged. He showed it to his grandson one evening, the boy wide-eyed as he held the cold steel. "It's heavy," the child whispered. Evans only nodded. "It was meant to be," he said. He did not tell him about the faces, the charges, the caves. He only said, "It kept me alive." That was the Colt's legacy distilled into words a child could understand. Behind them lay all the echoes of jungles, the sweat of islands, and the silence after laughter. The weapon's endurance stretched long after the war ended. It remained standard issue for the U.S. military until 1985, carried in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Even when replaced by newer designs, many units clung to it, unwilling to abandon the weight of its certainty. Special forces, veterans, and collectors alike recognize that some tools do not age. They only prove themselves again and again. To hold a Colt .45 was to feel history in the palm, to sense the weight of a design that had outlasted doubt. Yet legacies are not only about survival, they are also about transformation. For Evans, the pistol reshaped his view of war. He had entered the Pacific with skepticism, mocking whispers of its power echoing in his mind. He left convinced that no weapon should be underestimated. The Colt taught him that laughter could vanish in a single heartbeat, replaced by silence that stretched for a lifetime. Its lesson was harsh, but it endured. Never dismiss what you do not understand. The pistol's weight was more than steel. It was the burden of proof, carried in every soldier's hand. As the war's stories passed into history, the Colt became a relic displayed in glass cases, its frame reflecting museum lights. Visitors read plaques about its design, its service, its statistics. But veterans who stood before it saw more. They saw the jungle shadows, the flash of a muzzle, the moment laughter died. They remembered the echo that had followed them home, the pistol's unyielding voice. To the public, it was a piece of machinery. To those who carried it, it was memory forged in iron. Some designs are timeless. The helmet that shielded foreheads, the jeep that carried men across mud, the Colt .45 that silenced mockery. Its legacy was not in glory but in grim respect, in the way it turned laughter into fear, doubt into trust, and survival into testimony. Evans understood this as he grew older, his memories fading but never gone. He often said little about the war, but when pressed, he would murmur, "The pistol told the truth," and that truth was final. As unchanging as the steel itself, the war had ended, but the echoes of the Colt remained. They lingered in the stories told by veterans, in the respect of enemies who once laughed, in the weight of history that could be felt in its grip. It was more than a weapon, it was a verdict. And though the battles had ceased, its voice would still be heard, quiet but enduring, reminding all who listened that some designs are timeless because they cannot be ignored.